College sports in the United States have always been unique in how they organize themselves. With over 1,000 schools competing in the NCAA, teams are broken up into divisions to keep an even playing field for even the smallest universities. And within each division, there exist dozens of conferences. At the highest level, Division I FBS, 133 total teams compete within 10 conferences. Most of these conferences have shown resilience over the years and established themselves as pillars of the college sports landscape. But within the last 2 years, things have started to crumble. The Pac-12, one of the oldest and most prestigious of these conferences, is all but gone. The Big Ten and Big 12 are actively turning into mega conferences by absorbing every school they can, and the SEC is knocking on the ACC's door in an effort to steal some of the most highly valued programs in the country. Conference realignments have existed for years though, and they've all come with their own set of unique aches and pains. But I'm one to argue that most of the time, these changes are ultimately for the best as society evolves around the sports themselves. But there's something about this new wave of conference realignments that seems to have more evil intentions. Okay, maybe not evil, but definitely just a little bit dubious, mischievous, sus. We have things like unregulated name, image, and likeness deals, loose transfer portal rules, and billion-dollar TV contracts to deal with now. It's the Wild West out there. To get a full picture of where we are now, we need to first know where it all began. In 1896, 10 years before even the NCAA existed, the Intercollegiate Conference of Faculty Representatives met to establish a set of standards that their schools would adhere to when it came to sports. This was one of the first college sports conferences to ever exist, and by 1917, they had adopted the name that they still use today, the Big Ten. In the southern part of the country, something similar was happening. In 1892, 8 schools met to form the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association. The SIAA was kind of a mess, with schools leaving and coming back multiple times. And in 1921, a huge chunk of those schools left to find stability by forming the Southern Conference. It was a dream come true. The gang was all there, and things were going well. By 1928, they had 23 members. When you look at this roster of schools, they were a group full of dogs, man. I mean, you had all the names that are still big today. Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Clemson, LSU, but don't sleep on Sewanee now. They were staying competitive back in the day. Tulane had a couple undefeated seasons too. This conference was no joke. So what happened? The Southern Conference got a little too bloated and spread out too far to the point where travel costs were becoming impractical for many schools. As a result, in 1932, 13 schools decided to peacefully go off to form their own smaller conference that kept them from having to travel so far. This conference would go on to be named the Southeastern Conference. 20 years later, 7 more teams would leave the Southern Conference. The reasoning for this was a little bit more spicy than the SEC though. Throughout the 40s and into the 50s, the smaller schools in the SoCon with less fans weren't getting invited to bowl games, even when they were playing well. So these schools started throwing a fit, and the conference responded by placing a ban on postseason play altogether in 1951 to level the playing field. Kinda sounds like communism to me, but anyways, Clemson and Maryland heard about this ban and just said, nah, screw that noise, and decided to go to their bowl game anyways. The conference then suspended them from conference play for a full season the next year. So the South Carolina state legislature stepped in and forced the SoCon to allow the Clemson-South Carolina rivalry game to still happen. I'm so glad that lawmakers in the 1950s were at least doing something right. This whole debacle ticked off all the bigger schools in the SoCon, so Clemson, Maryland, and 5 others broke off to form the Atlantic Coast Conference. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, there was a whole other set of drama going on. The Pacific Coast Conference was mostly the same big-time West Coast schools that everyone knows and loves today, but back in those days, they were up to no good. In 1924, USC got suspended from the conference altogether for paying athletes and allowing them to fail classes and still play. The PCC hired a former FBI agent to investigate corruption throughout the conference and came back in 1939 with a 2 million word report of all the wrongdoings. In 1951, Oregon got caught for paying recruits, and they still sucked, so it wasn't even worth it. Like, how bad you gotta be to be paying your players and still losing almost all your games? By 1956, it came to a peak. Washington fired their head football coach, who proceeded to blab about a slush fund the university had been using to pay their players. UCLA got caught for pretty much the same type of thing a few months later, which prompted them to point out that USC and Cal were no goody two-shoes either. With the Pacific Coast Conference now basically being a laughingstock in the NCAA for how poor their administration was, the conference disbanded in 1959. So you know what they did? They just all got back together by 1964, minus Idaho. And rebranded as the Pac-8, which 5 decades later would grow to become the Pac-12. So we've talked about the first 4 of the 5 power conferences, but the new kid on the block has only been around since 1994. Don't get me wrong, there's a whole video's worth of twists and turns that this conference's members took on their journey to joining together, but I'm going to keep it short and sweet here. Media deals became a much bigger concern for schools in the late 1980s thanks to an antitrust lawsuit in 1984 that forced the NCAA into relinquishing control over television rights to the conferences. As a result, the East Coast and West Coast schools thrived in this era due to their proximity to large viewership markets. But for the Big 8 conference, which consists mostly of schools in the middle of nowhere, they were struggling to attract media companies to televise football games that would rarely be able to get the same ratings as other big conferences were getting. The more successful programs at the time, like Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Colorado, started getting antsy, and there were serious threats that the Big 8 could dissolve at any moment. Thankfully, they weren't the only conference struggling at this time. The Southwestern Conference was having their own set of internal issues, similar to the Big 8's, since they were located in roughly the same region. One of the most notable of these issues was SMU's death penalty punishment, which turned the best program in the conference into an embarrassment of a team in a matter of 2 years. The Big 8 saw the opportunity of the struggling Southwest Conference and sweet-talked 4 of their teams into joining them and officially forming the Big 12 in 1994. With a more rounded-out roster of colleges, the Big 12 established itself as a force to be reckoned with, and the stage was finally set for the Battle of the Power Five. Since the formation of the Big 12, these 5 conferences have been in an arms race to get ahead of each other. The ACC was proactive to pick up a few Big East schools in 2004, but other than that, it was pretty quiet in terms of realignment. Everyone was in their own lane, and competition was relatively even as far as the 2 revenue sports go. This was pretty much the golden age of college sports, if you ask me, but in 2010, we soiled it. The Big 10 stole Nebraska from the Big 12, Maryland from the ACC, and Rutgers from the Big East. Okay, that's not too bad. Those schools weren't really all that good at football at the time anyways. The Pac-12 got Colorado and Utah. Again, those schools weren't huge moves either, but here's where it kind of gets nuts. The ACC held nothing back and basically ripped the heart out of the Big East by taking 4 of their most valuable teams. The Big East, which was kind of like a fringe power conference at the time, was basically dead now at the hands of the Power 5. The SEC wasn't messing around either by adding Missouri and Texas A&M, which has one of the biggest fan bases in the entire country. The Big 12 wasn't about to go back to being the Big 8 though, so they managed to stay afloat by adding West Virginia and TCU. But you might be asking, why would they even do this if they had a good thing going? Well, of course it was the root of all evil. Money! The Big 10 had just started their own network and wanted to expand their reach wider into bigger markets like DC and New York. The Pac-12 had a media deal that was expiring in 2011 and wanted more power in their contract negotiations with broadcasters. The SEC got A&M because they knew it was a power move to add a team that big, and, well, the ACC just seemed to be doing it because everyone else was. In the last couple years, we've seen another wave of conference realignments revolving around money again. In 2021, the NCAA lost a court case where players now have the right to earn money from their own image, and coincidentally, transfer rules were relaxed at the same time. While it's good that athletes finally have the freedoms that they deserve, a side effect has been breakout players at smaller schools transferring to bigger programs that offer more opportunities for sponsorships and promotions. In other words, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. This has put a much bigger pressure on media deals than it ever has before. If your conference isn't getting a big enough paycheck from your broadcaster, and if you aren't able to get enough national attention for donors to want to open their wallets for you, you're already at a huge disadvantage in recruiting, no matter how good your coaches are or how much history you have. No conference felt the effect of this worse than the Pac-12, who mismanaged their money and broadcasting methods so bad that UCLA and USC got fed up and joined the Big 10. 1 year later, Oregon and Washington announced that they would join them, and the Big 12 went ahead and picked up Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah to make up for the 2 powerhouses they lost to the SEC in Texas and Oklahoma. And once again, the ACC didn't want to be left out, so they picked up Stanford and Cal plus SMU. Is it stupid that the Atlantic Coast Conference now has 3 teams west of the Mississippi? Yes. Is this going to be a permanent fix though? I highly doubt it. It's pretty obvious that this is just a move to keep the conference competitive for the next couple years, so that they can maybe get a better media deal and keep their existing teams from leaving. Sooner or later though, Cal and Stanford will have a better option than having their athletes and coaches in constant jet lag and will leave the conference. And it's looking pretty likely that Florida State will leave the second they have the chance, and they could very well drag Clemson along with them. There's a lot of different ways that this can all go down in the next couple years, so let's look at every timeline. Okay, maybe not every timeline, but we can look at least a few. I came up with 3 potential outcomes I could see happening. With something like this, you have to take a lot of time researching trends, keeping up with rumors, and knowing you have reputable sources. I came up with all this during my lunch break at work. It took me like 20 minutes to write all this down, so don't get mad at me if you're upset with any of these predictions. If the ACC loses Stanford, Cal, Clemson, and Florida State, that will most likely send the conference into collapse, and they'll see the same fate that the Pac-12 did. The SEC has always stayed regional in their acquisitions, so they'll probably stick to going after the southern schools that are left: Miami, Georgia Tech, and the North Carolina schools. The Big Ten will probably get dibs over the Big 12, so they'll go after the schools with the biggest recognition in the northern half of the ACC: Virginia, Virginia Tech, Pitt, Syracuse, and most importantly, Notre Dame. Notre Dame can't stay independent in football forever, so with the ACC dissolving for all their other sports, this would be the perfect time for the Big Ten to do their thing.
Hey Mater, it's nice to finally be back in Radiator Springs. I want you.
The Big 12 won't be left with nothing though. In addition to Cal and Stanford, I could see them getting the edge on Louisville over the Big 10, who's a school that seems to always be underrated in how well they perform. Boston College and SMU might sneak in as well, but I've got a feeling nobody's going to want them, so I had them being relegated to the American Athletic Conference. This was the darkest timeline that I wanted to cover. Of course, there's a lot of thoughts floating around of the SEC and Big Ten becoming all-consuming superpowers, controlling every corner of college sports and leveling anyone that stands in their way. But the idea of that is scary to me, and I am a fragile little boy, so I'm going to stick to thinking happy thoughts as much as I can. With that being said, let's see how the ACC could stay intact if they lose a few of their teams. If Stanford, Cal, and Florida State leave, Clemson and Miami will probably still follow, knowing they have the value the SEC is looking for. We're also going to assume Notre Dame joins the Big Ten, just like the last scenario. Now the ACC not only has to make up for the teams they just lost, but they also have to add even more teams to get numbers comparable to the others to keep up. That means they're going to have to start getting creative with who they add. First, they go after the programs in the East with growing fan bases and successful revenue sports: App State, Liberty, JMU, and Coastal Carolina. Yeah, I know they have smaller facilities and less history, but let's remember, this is if the ACC is in absolute survival mode. Getting the 2 military academies could be a good idea too. Sure, they have a pretty low ceiling of football success in the way their schools operate, but they do have the best rivalry in college sports and built-in fan bases of millions of families across the globe. To take it even one step further, the ACC might even go to the schools that have been dying to join for ages: ECU and UConn. ECU has diehard fans that every other school in North Carolina is annoyed by, so they'll waste no time in forming rivalries. And UConn will add value in men's and women's basketball, if nothing else at all. Now, most of these schools that I have moving to the ACC are from the American and Sunbelt conferences, so I think that they will go ahead and trim off their lower performing schools and merge with the intention of becoming some sort of a weird Frankenstein mega conference themselves. Conference USA will pick up the scraps to stay alive, and the Mountain West and MAC will continue doing their own thing. They know their place, they don't want any beef, they're just trying to chill. Now looking at all the conferences beside each other, there's a pretty clear but at least stable hierarchy. The Big Ten and SEC are the 2 football heavy hitters, and then we have the ACC and Big 12 that hold their own in football, but whose strengths really lie in all the other sports. The American Sun is almost there, but still not quite competitive enough to call themselves a power conference. But the last 3 conferences are just chilling, man. They're just living their best lives. Sure, they're getting shoved around when they face off against bigger schools, but they shake it off and go on about their seasons on their own. I actually don't hate this scenario. Yeah, it would suck being an ACC fan and not having Clemson and Florida State for big football games, but at least the main rivalries are still intact and the conference would stay on the East Coast. The last scenario that I want to consider is the most optimistic, but also has the least likelihood of happening. This would be if the Pac-12 were to somehow get back together. This would only be able to happen if there were enough West Coast teams that would be able to make more money than they are in their current situation. For Washington State and Oregon State, who will most likely be independent or in the much smaller Mountain West, they should be the first ones to want to join this cause. We can say that about Cal and Stanford too, who are receiving much less revenue from ESPN as the rest of the ACC's members, and the ACC isn't getting that much money to begin with. As for the Big 12 and Big 10, it might be harder to convince the teams to leave the pools of cash they're swimming in right now, but I think with enough pressure from both fans and athletes getting sick of so many cross-country matchups, it might be possible to convince UCLA, USC, Washington, Oregon, Arizona, and Arizona State to come back to their roots. Colorado and Utah probably still won't leave just because they actually have more history with the members of the Big 12. So to truly make it the Pac-12 again, they need to add 2 more members, and San Diego State and Boise State would be the top 2 candidates. Just like how the PCC split up and reformed just a few years later into the Pac, there's still maybe just a little bit of hope that it could happen again in a few years to set things right and bring balance to college sports. Okay, so we've talked about what went down in the past, what's going down now, and what could go down in the future. But what I really want to talk about is how it should be going down in a perfect world. When we break down why people are really upset with conference realignments, it isn't because their teams aren't getting enough money, or good TV partnerships, or even having to travel so much. The things fans and players care about the most is preserving the most competitive and emotional matchups year to year. When Maryland left the ACC, I wasn't mad because we were going to have less leverage in our media deal. I was mad because I hate Maryland, just like everyone else in the ACC hated Maryland. I wanted to beat those stupid little turtles every time they came to Raleigh. Oh, what's that? You beat Phillip Rivers in his last game at Carter Finley Stadium? How about the time you blew a 27-point lead to Mike freaking Glennon? Roll Pack till I die, baby. So being the engineer that I am and needing hard data to back up my decisions, I mapped out every single rivalry in the FBS. Source? Bro, just trust. I looked it all up on Wikipedia. Obviously, it's not a perfect diagram. Like, there's a rivalry listed for Miami of Florida and Miami of Ohio just because their names are the same, but it still shows us, generally speaking, where our problems lie. I mean, look at this crap, man. How are we supposed to thrive in these conditions? There's lines all over the place. It's awful. So what I'm going to try and do is try my best to clean up these tangles and rebuild these conferences with the least amount of interconference rivalries. So we're just going to move this team here and move that one there, and oh crap. Okay, so I accidentally destroyed the American Conference. It was kind of like a loose thread that unraveled the whole sweater. When I moved one team, it only made sense to move another, and another, and another, and then all gone. Also, there were a lot of weird teams sticking out and conferences that would make for a lot of blowout games. Tulane made it back to the SEC. Almost every school in Texas is now in the Big 12, and UMass is in the ACC. This obviously isn't a good conclusion, so I reached out to someone that is a much better expert in college sports conferences than I am, Dalukes. His channel is amazing. I used his videos as a big reference for our little history lesson a couple minutes ago, so let's see what he came up with.
I hope we can all agree that conferences are at their best when they're full of rivalries and schools with history with each other. The ACC's greatest additions were taking Big East schools that had history with some of their existing schools, after all. Something the SEC has so far replicated with their additions of Oklahoma and Texas, reminding schools like Texas A&M and Missouri of their old stomping grounds. But an issue still arises with these conferences. They're too dang big. So with my conferences, I tried to shrink them down a bit to size. My first idea was to make conferences of 10 teams each, ensuring each team plays every school in their conference, getting rid of conference championship games and placing the conference winner outright in a playoff system where each conference champion makes the playoff. In the end, I decided I'd go with 12 teams per conference for the sake of geography, even going so far as to add a few group of 5 schools I think could cut it in power conferences instead. They focus on retaining a geographic region as well as historical rivalries between schools inside them. Do you think a 10-team or a 12-team conference is better? Let us know in the comments below. Anyway, let's start in the Northeast. Here we have Army, Boston College, UConn, Rutgers, Maryland, Syracuse, Virginia, Virginia Tech, and the 4 Tobacco Road schools, NC State, North Carolina, Duke, and Wake Forest. Separating the North from the South Carolina schools was a tough decision, but at the end of the day, I felt like Clemson and South Carolina were a better fit for the SEAC than the NEAC. The 2 smaller schools to join are UConn, which is basically just a power conference school already with a terrible football program, and Army, whose elite academics and tradition put them at play here over schools like UMass or Temple. With them joining the American this season as well, it makes sense to see what they can do here. If you'd rather, though, they can be replaced by a school like Navy. Moving south to the SEAC, this conference is mainly built off of Deep South schools like Alabama, Auburn, Mississippi State and Ole Miss, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Tennessee, Clemson, South Carolina, Florida, Florida State, Miami. Originally here were UCF and Vanderbilt instead of Ole Miss and MSU, who were originally in the Southwest. I decided to bring those 2 schools in and move Vanderbilt to the Midwestern Conference despite all their rivals being here, which I'll talk about later. Despite that decision, this conference is full of historical rivalries, like clean old-fashioned hate becoming a conference rivalry, as well as having all 3 Florida schools in the same conference for maximum Florida man energy. This might be the most impressive football conference here. I mean, who's the little guy? MSU? Georgia Tech? Moving up north to the Midwest. Kind of the Midwest. Here we have some teams you might expect in a Midwest conference. Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Purdue, Indiana, Cincinnati. But you also have a few outliers. Pittsburgh and Penn State join an eastern branch with West Virginia to keep the backyard brawl in conference. Kentucky and Vanderbilt form a southern range, and Louisville keeps their rivalry with the Wildcats in conference. Aside from being a very strong basketball conference, this league has the potential to be one of the most interesting culturally as well, with tons of rivalries being preserved here. But I'm sure some of you are asking, why Vandy here? Well, the alternative was to kick them out of power conferences altogether, which doesn't sit well with me. But Vandy's academic excellence pairs better with schools like Indiana, Purdue, and even Ohio State better than some of their peers in other conferences. They might not be a great historical fit in this conference, but they feel like a good culture fit, if that makes sense. Moving to the Southwest, where you can feel a whole bunch of Texas. Aside from the historical Southwest Conference, Arkansas, Texas, Texas A&M, TCU, Baylor, Texas Tech, and even SMU in Houston, there are some other strong additions here, namely Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and LSU, as well as the team I wish would be added to the Power 5 the most, in Tulane. While LSU does get ripped away from their historical rivals like Florida and Ole Miss, they retain the game with Arkansas as well as regain the battle for the RAG. While this conference seems a little heavy on the P5 move-ups in Houston and SMU as well as Tulane, it could still become one of the most competitive conferences in the NCAA due to the high projected ceilings for those G5 additions. Just keep the gold Trans Ams away. Moving up north, we reach the Great Plains Athletic Conference, featuring the rest of the Big Ten West and the old Big 12 North, as well as guest Colorado State. This conference is perhaps my favorite, not just because K-State's in there. Look at all the rivalries between schools that are similar to each other culturally. Nebraska-Colorado becomes an in-conference rivalry, as does Mizzou's rivalries with both Kansas and Illinois. Cyhawk stays in conference, as does the oft-forgotten telephone trophy rivalry between Iowa State and Mizzou. And despite losing some of their Eastern-focused rivalries, schools like Minnesota and Wisconsin get to keep their rivalry with each other for Paul Bunyan's axe, as well as keeping the oft-memed quadrangle of hate between Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin in conference. Now this is some Midwestern action. But wait, you say, Colorado isn't in the Midwest. And that's true. But they actually fit better here than they do in a Western-focused conference. Boulder is a geographic outlier for whatever conference they're in. In fact, their travel in this conference is significantly reduced when compared to what it could be in the Pac-12. Their furthest opponent in the Great Plains is Northwestern at 1,027 miles away. Their furthest opponent in the Pac-12 was Washington at just under 1,300 miles. Their closest opponent in the Pac-12 was 507 miles away, in Utah, while their closest opponent here in the Great Plains is K-State, 7 miles further. It's actually faster to get to Manhattan from Boulder than it would be Salt Lake City from Boulder. They're weirdly enough a better fit here than there. But why Colorado State instead of, say, North Dakota State? Well, for starters, they're another in-conference rival to a team in Colorado. And despite not keeping the other border war, they do fit within the geographical range, as well as being a university that could easily become a Power 5 school if they had a Power 5 budget. Plus, they're essentially green K-State or Iowa State without as much athletic success. They belong here. Lastly, we have the Mountain Pacific Conference, which is just the Pac-12 without Colorado and adding Boise State. Or BYU, whichever fits your preference. You'll notice that Notre Dame remained an independent, which is something BYU had pursued for a while. While they're definitely happy in the Big 12 now, I can't see schools like Berkeley or Stanford wanting the Cougs in conference. Then again, they wouldn't want the Blue Broncos either. There aren't many options here that make sense to replace Colorado. San Diego State could, as could UNLV or even Idaho if you wanted to bring the PCC back. I'll just say this, Mountain West fans. Imagine the old Pac-12 with your favorite team instead of Colorado, and that's this conference. Now go eviscerate me in the comments.
Alright, that's some pretty good stuff, but I've still got my own ideas. In my perfect world, there isn't exactly a perfect set of 6 power conferences with 12 teams like Lucas had. I'm not very good at making rules for myself, so I've used 12 teams as the norm, but not the requirement for each conference. And I've never loved the idea of a clear-cut line between the good conferences and the bad conferences. So I mixed it up maybe a little bit more just to make things more interesting. Don't get me wrong, the Power 5 conferences are still there, but are much more slimmed down. The biggest moves for these conferences were Florida State to the SEC, Notre Dame to the Big 10, Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas A&M back to the Big 12, South Carolina and Maryland returning to the ACC, and of course the Pac-12 revival with the addition of San Diego State, who I think is the best Mountain West athletic program. As for the rest of the conferences, I went ahead and formed a Northeastern Conference out of a lot of those teams I trimmed off of the ACC, Big 10, and Big 12 to serve as the 6th power conference. After that, geography became more important than anything else, to be honest. What I'm calling the Rocky Mountain Conference could still be considered something of a power conference itself with a lot of big name schools. The Appalachian and Gulf Coast conferences both have a good handful of programs on the rise as well, like UCF, Houston, JMU, and Liberty. The MAC, I of course left pretty much unchanged. They're like the horseshoe crab of college sports. It could be a million years and they'd still look the same. God's perfect creation. Finally, the last 2 conferences I made, the Frontier and Deep South, consist mostly of smaller schools that put less of an emphasis on revenue sports. So no matter whose idea you like more between me and Lucas's, I think we can all agree that they're both better than what we have now. And when 2 random dudes on the internet are making more sense than the old men and mega corporations making all the decisions in the world of college sports, it's pretty easy to conclude that the system is broken. So how do we actually fix it then? Eat the rich, burn down the establishment, reject society, and return to a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. No more football, no more TV, no more watching NC State miss the conference championship every single year, no more pain. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there.
Good snap, good hold, and the kick is blocked! Appalachian State has stunned the college football world.
Thompson looking, changes direction, scrambling, end zone, touchdown!
Boise State for the win. They hand it off to Johnson. Boise State has won the Tostitos Fiesta Bowl.
And Chris Davis takes it in the back of the end zone. He'll run it out to the 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 45. There goes Davis. Oh my God! Davis is going to run it all the way back. Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win the football game.
They're going to throw it. Leary's going to take a shot. Has a receiver. It is caught. Touchdown NC State.